Well, welcome to the second half of Drydock episode 351. So let's press on with the questions then. Time's a-wasting. Eric Van Dooting asks, if the Japanese Navy had pressed forward with completing Shinano as a battleship and made her a high priority item without all of the stoppages, redesign work and delays that happened historically, could she have been ready in time to be part of Center Force at Leyte Gulf? Well, historically speaking, if you look at Yamato and Musashi, they take just a little over 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. Now, of course, part of that does involve the delays, particularly for Musashi, surrounding the beginning of World War II for Japan. And although Yamato is commissioned somewhat earlier, she's also subject to a few minor delays here and there while Japan is, gearing up for and then enacting the first phases of its World War II expansion plans. But if we took that as an approximate average and then we look at the keel laying date of Shinano, which you can see here in Drydock being built, then you probably just about could, because she was slow walked for the first half of 1942 while they tried to work out what they were going to do with her. Now, admittedly, then converting her to a carrier, it was a little bit of a faster job completion than it would have been building her as a battleship, due to various things, including the lack of the need for the massive heavy machinery and so forth for the installation of the turrets and the guns. But if you go purely from her keel laying and you take an average of Yamato and Musashi's keel to commission time, and as per the question, we completely hand wave away wartime shortages and so forth, then in theory she could be commissioned in mid to late 1944 in time for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Now, she would be a very newly commissioned ship, but it could be done, assuming you could find enough crewmen to stock her. Library of Context asks, regarding dual-purpose gun ammunition, is the same shell used for air engagements, surface engagements and land bombardment, or is there dedicated munitions for each task? Obviously, the introduction of the proximity fuse forces a differentiation, but what about before that? So, aside from specialist rounds like illumination rounds, star shell, that kind of thing, broadly speaking, the most commonly used dual-purpose guns during the Second World War would have at least two main types of ammunition. You'd have a high explosive or high capacity round, which was also your anti-aircraft round, and whether it was more specialized towards surface engagement, high explosive rolls, and also happened to be a big boom with some fragments that you could fire at aircraft, or whether it was more of a specialized anti-aircraft fragmentation round with a big charge that you would also use in surface engagements and shore bombardments when you needed a high explosive round, would obviously depend on the Navy and depend on the gun as well. But almost all dual-purpose weapons would also have access to a shell that was a bit more suited for surface engagements. Exactly what it was called, whether it was called semi-armor piercing or common or all sorts of other things, it depended on the Navy, but broadly speaking, that other kind of shell was more optimized for punching through the side plating of a ship and then detonating inside. It's almost never a full AP round because, frankly, a 4.5 or 5-inch AP round is a little bit pointless, but it would have some properties of that sort of round, hence semi-armor piercing probably being the best descriptor if you wanted to use one across the board. So things like a base fuse instead of a nose fuse, a slight delay on the fuse, and perhaps a slightly more optimized shell body construction rather than just here's a big can of explosive. And of course, even for your high explosive or anti-aircraft round, which role you were using it in would depend very much on the fuse you put on it. So before the VT fuse, if you put a mechanically timed fuse on the shell, then you're probably using it as an anti-aircraft shell. If you put a contact detonation fuse on the nose, then you're probably using it in a shore bombardment or surface engagement role. But just because in theory a given dual-purpose gun could have access to those two primary kinds of shells didn't necessarily mean they always did, and things would vary, as I said, depending on time period and depending on the use as well. So, for example, the British convoy escort converted merchantmen that were turned into anti-aircraft escort ships or submarine depot ships or something like that, they would only have high explosive or anti-aircraft shells aboard. No one gave them semi-armor piercing shells because, well, if they were ever in a situation where they needed them, flinging high explosive was probably going to be about as effective. And if you didn't need them, then, well, it's better to have more anti-aircraft purposed shells, because that's generally what you're going to be using the guns for. And similarly, when you look at, again, for example, with the British aircraft carriers, at the start of World War II, British carriers 4.5-inch guns carry mostly high explosive anti-air shells, but they do have a stock of semi-armor piercing shells. By the time of the British Pacific Fleet, they've taken the semi-armor piercing shells away and given them essentially exclusively anti-aircraft shells, with a handful of, star shell and that kind of stuff as well. Smelly Kaka asks, a few sources, notably Garski, Julian and Duran, say that during the torpedo attack from Victorious, Bismarck's helmsman struggled to hear his captain's orders and so was apparently forced to steer the ship on his own initiative. Sources aren't that consistent about the extent to which he did this, or if it happened at all. What's your opinion on it? And on the general theme, can you mention any notable examples where a competent job by somebody much too junior to be doing it was important to a positive outcome? So I had a quick look through various creditable and well-reputed sources about Bismarck, various books and interviews and so forth, books by good authors, including, of course, the Garski, Julian and Duran's one. And I think that Hans Hansen, the Bismarck's helmsman, definitely was steering partially on his own during the attack by Victorious's aircraft. Part of it can be derived from the fact that he was awarded a fairly high medal in the aftermath, which you don't do to someone who's just following orders. So certainly the command echelon of Bismarck seems to have thought he did something quite extraordinary. But also, interestingly, the more reputable the source and the more comprehensive the source, the more and more this incident is mentioned. And specifically, actually, the number of them go into detail about the fact that, the command staff and Hansen are somewhat separated, which would make things difficult. At the best time, you would have to yell. But also, he's in the normal navigation position, but there's a massive cacophony of anti-aircraft guns going off right next to him, which is the problem. The noise of the AA fire is overcoming shouted orders that are being yelled at him. So he's sort of looking around going, well, one, it's almost impossible to hear people yelling orders when there's this AA barrage going off next to me. And two, as the engagement goes on, that amount of anti-aircraft gunfire is basically temporarily deafening him. So even when the gunfire is dying down in between attacks, or it just isn't firing in the local vicinity of the bridge, he still can't hear anything. So he's just like, well, I guess I'm making it up as I go along. Off we go. And mostly, to be fair, does a pretty good job of it. I mean, Bismarck only takes a single hit, and as Baron Mulheim von Reichberg mentions, very, very luckily for Bismarck, it's a near-surface runner, so it hits the armour belt rather than deeper down in the ship. And to be perfectly honest, when it comes to Bismarck, it's actually one of the easier incidents in my mind to lay to rest, partly because there's no contradictory statements to it. The ones that go into more detail tend to mention Hansen being deafened by the AA fire and having to make choices on his own. Others just mention that he was there and he was manoeuvring the ship really well, and they tend to be less detailed, and very précis coverages will just mention that Bismarck was manoeuvring. So there's nothing specifically that says anything contrary to the idea that Hansen was having to make up some of the manoeuvres as he went. And so we can, take a reasonable estimate that this is very likely to be true. Which is quite a refreshing change, actually, because a lot of the more controversial things about Bismarck, especially surrounding its final battle, was it sunk, was it scuttled, with people actively ordering, all that kind of stuff. There are accounts, obviously, that would indicate that, yes, this did happen, but there are also other accounts from survivors that indicate it didn't happen. Or at least didn't happen in the way that people who just read one or two exclusive statements by one or two exclusive survivors would indicate. As far as the more general theme of a good job being done by someone far too junior, there's loads of examples throughout naval history, usually involving where senior command crew have been killed, injured, or otherwise put out of action or communication, and junior officers or even enlisted have taken over and just gone, well, we're doing this job anyway. One notable example, going back a little bit to the 7 Years' War in the Age of Sail, would actually be what set the stage for James Cook eventually becoming the captain of various voyages of exploration. Because during the 7 Years' War, during Royal Navy operations against Canada, the French held part of Canada specifically, Cook was a ship's master on a lowly fourth rate. So not a commissioned officer, not on a particularly large ship of the line, not even brought out there for any specific skills other than his ability to navigate and supervise a ship. And then he just turns out to be one of the best cartographers of the period and ends up charting, surveying, mapping the entirety of pretty much the area the Royal Navy's operating in, allowing them to enact some of the strategies that they do along the St. Lawrence River. And given the size and scale of the fleet effort, in theory, there should have been either specialist cartographers brought along with the fleet, or surveyors, or commissioned officers with the relevant training, etc. And either they weren't there or they weren't as good as this random ship's master. The Judge 2017 asks, how inferior is secondary and tertiary or turret range finding to main or radar-guided gunnery? Would the shift be noticeable in terms of accurate fire when seen from the enemy? Very much depends on the ship, because ultimately the data is being processed, at least we're talking in the Dreadnought period, by the fire control computer, or the plotting computer, whatever you want to call it. So it's mostly about the quality of data being put in. The advantage of primary rangefinders, at least for the most part, tends to be twofold. One, they're normally mounted considerably higher, and two, they tend to be considerably larger than those found on secondary turrets or tertiary batteries if you have a split battery. And therefore, being able to see further because they're higher means they can engage at longer ranges, and they get a better view of the enemy ship. So a secondary or tertiary rangefinder won't be able to engage at quite the same distance, which obviously could be a problem if you're in a long-range gunfight. And secondly, because when you're talking about optical rangefinders, if your primary rangefinder system has a very wide base, then your level of precision and your level of accuracy, therefore the quality of the data you're feeding into the fire control computer, is going to be higher. And a smaller, narrower, literally, rangefinder with a shorter base is not going to return as accurate data. Now, again, at closer ranges, this might not matter so much because the level of quality of data will be good enough. But at medium to long ranges, at least in terms of battleship engagements, it could make a very significant difference, assuming that you can even see that far. The interesting thing, of course, is that turret-based rangefinders tend to be some of, if not the largest on a ship, so theoretically actually get some of the highest quality data, but they are mounted pretty much the lowest of all the rangefinders, so they can't see quite as far. Some of that is to do with the fact that, well, the turrets are relatively low in the ship as far as rangefinder positions go, and some of that is to do with the fact that if you've ever seen the rangefinder on an Iowa class or something like that, they're huge, and sticking such a thing really high up on a ship could lead to some issues. Of course, radar guidance is a whole separate thing, which depends on the quality of the radar, the weather, and a number of other factors. And of course, you've got to hope that your Navy has been sensible enough to have your fire control computer wired up such that it can receive data from your secondaries. But assuming that this is the case, if you are fighting at close to medium range and your main rangefinder goes down for whatever reason, assuming everyone can switch to the secondary inputs pretty quickly, then you probably, in most ships, won't notice too much of a difference in overall data quality. But if you're fighting at medium to long range, let's say the high teens and then into the 20s or thousands of yards or longer, then there probably is going to be a noticeable drop in the quality of data for most ships if you suddenly lose your main uppermost rangefinders and or radar and you're forced to switch to your secondaries. The other thing, of course, is in the best systems, when it comes to optical rangefinding, you're using multiple inputs from multiple different rangefinders, both primary and secondary and tertiary if they exist, in order to produce an overall average figure. And if you lose some of your primary rangefinders, for example, then even if you're at short to medium range, you have lost some of your data points, which inherently will make the overall result that you process afterwards somewhat less accurate, unless they happen to be out by a certain amount. Nick Brodar asks, given the Kriegsmarine's significant losses during the Norway campaign at the hands of a rather haphazard Royal Navy opposition, could more effective Royal Navy intervention have completely destroyed the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet? Completely destroyed as in wiped out every single Kriegsmarine surface unit? Probably not. But in terms of effectively destroying the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet as a working entity, then yes, absolutely, that could have happened. A minor example would be if Renown was left more alone by the Admiralty or given somewhat better information, so that Renown and her destroyers and the mine-laying destroyers, etc., just stayed pretty much where they were, because they would have been then in a position to intercept the Narvik attack force, so take out the 10 destroyers that are heading for Narvik before they get there. That saves Narvik and wipes out to a man, well, admittedly, a destroyer force that got wiped out to a man anyway, but without the Norwegians having to lose Norgay and Eidsvold and so forth. And that might in turn bring Scharnhorst and Guneisenau running to try and help, but that delays what would eventually become the action off Lofoten enough that Repulse might be able to join up with Renown, and Renown and Repulse plus destroyers ganging up on Scharnhorst and Guneisenau. Well, Renown managed to drive off the Scharnhorst on her own, so add her sister and bunch of destroyers. It's probably not ending well for the Germans there. And then, as you can see in the sort of middle part of this picture, the slightly confused nature of the home fleet sailing, because they thought that the forces that were being spotted by aerial reconnaissance were a fleet breakout into the Atlantic rather than an invasion of Norway. If they'd realised that this was, in fact, an invasion of Norway, then instead of heading sort of northeast for an interception of a breakout, they could have headed more east by northeast or possibly even east, at which point interception of Hipper's group heading for Trondheim almost certainly would have occurred. They would have been wiped out. There's no contest at that point. And potentially, you could also send, as you can see down there on the bottom left, first and second cruiser squadrons. They might, I stress might, be able to intercept the German groups heading for Bergen. Maybe Egersund. I'm not so certain about that one. And of course, the further south you get, the more at risk you are from recently established, very, very recently established German air bases in Denmark. But in theory, the home fleet and the cruiser squadrons could continue south, perhaps after destroying Hipper's group. And if they can't save Egersund and Kristiansand, they might at least be able to intercept the German naval forces as they try and beat a retreat. That probably could catch the Bergen force, I think, and destroy that. The big thing, of course, is that, as I said, one, you're risking more and more ships the closer you get to Denmark, and two, there's not a huge amount the Royal Navy can really do about Group 5, the one that's heading to Oslo, because that's on the wrong side of Denmark. So that would leave Oscarsborg Fortress to take out Blücher and damage Lutzow. Well, technically, Lutzow was damaged by one of the other shore batteries, but you get the general idea. So they're not really in a realistic position to wipe out everything, but they are in a decent position, with a few minor changes, to at least get rid of groups 1, 2, and 3, possibly 6, and very, very maybe 4. Can't really do anything about 5, but potentially, collectively, could wipe out a good chunk of the Kriegsmarine's surface forces. And even if Scharnhorst and Guneisenau beat a retreat from Renown and Repulse up north, if you've got the home fleet and various cruiser squadrons patrolling in the gap between Scapa and Bergen, and you put up a bunch of aerial recon, there's a very good chance you might catch them on the way back, and, well, the force that the Home Fleet put out would easily put down the Scharnhorst, which would leave Germany with a damaged Lutzow and the Admiral Scheer as the sum total of anything they have afloat that isn't armed with 5.9-inch guns or less. And they wouldn't be all that much armed with 5.9-inch guns either. Mon Squire asks, in the book The Collapse of the Third Republic, the author William L. Shirer states in pages 248 to 250 that the French army, on paper the strongest in Europe, was a paper tiger geared for defence and not offence, Gamlin's words, and that the British, in their view, had unilaterally abrogated the Versailles Treaty with a naval pact signed with Germany in 1935, with London not bothering to inform Italy or France of this direct acceptance of Germany's violation of the treaty. In your opinion, was this pact with Germany a factor in the later French refusal to intervene when Germany moved into the Rhineland? And do you think it helped to sour the French attitude toward the British, hindering their willingness to join with them? Did the French Navy hold the same defeatist views as the Army, and how prepared was the Navy in terms of ship readiness, drill and planning to actually fight? Were the line officers and enlisted members more willing to fight than their Army counterparts? Now, as I've said before, I'm not a land-based historian, and I'm certainly not a political historian, so the first half of the question, I don't really feel comfortable in talking about any kind of significant details, because, well, it's not my field of expertise, but the general feeling I get, and obviously take this with however much salt you want, is that France had a number of its own reasons for not intervening when Germany went into the Rhineland, and some of those reasons actually are very similar to some of the British reasons for not getting involved, which essentially come down to the fact that neither country was particularly confident in their military state of readiness at that point in time, and France also had some financial issues to deal with. But essentially they were looking at their militaries and going, we're not actually sure that we have modern enough militaries to deal with this situation, compounded by the fact, of course, they didn't know exactly what Germany had sent into the Rhineland. And so, you know, France was kind of, well, we'll go if Britain and Italy go, and Britain was going, we don't really want to go, and also the army really isn't in a fit state to go, so, you know, we're going to make some vague noises about maybe helping, but nothing concrete. You know, this whole, well, we've run down our military in the interests of financial expediency, and now there's a aggressive power taking bits of territory we'd rather they wouldn't, but we don't really feel we've actually got the military to intervene, so we're just going to make loud noises about sanctioning them and hope that they go away. Yeah, that's a pattern that repeats itself in history. But as far as the French Navy goes, certainly going into World War II, I would say if, and I stress if, you hold that the French army had relatively defeatist views, the French Navy certainly wasn't anywhere near as badly affected. The French Navy was quite eager in the late 1930s, in as much as they were looking forward to combat at all, but if it was going to come down to combat, the French Navy was actually quite eager to prove itself and take on the Germans with what they held fairly rightfully to be, you know, a superior fleet. Although some of the overall attitudes of the French Navy you probably see in the aftermath of Operation Catapult, with the attack on Mers El Kabir, the standoff in Alexandria, various incidents in British ports and so forth. And the general feeling I get from that is that the rank and file of the Marine Nationale were very eager to fight, and generally speaking, in all of those incidents, it seems to be the rank and file and the junior officers who are mostly in favour of keeping on the fight, and the more senior you get up the officer tree, the less and less enthusiastic they are about continuing a fight. And, you know, sometimes this gets reduced down to very crude, broad statements which don't help anyone, where, you know, some people on both sides of the argument will say, oh, well, you know, the French didn't want to fight. And it's like, no, that's not true. And other people say, well, you know, the French wanted to stay home and guard France because potential German threats to their families or whatever. It's like, well, that's not true either. Some officers in the Marine Nationale certainly seem to have thought that way. But if you look at both British and French histories of that period, if it hadn't been for the most senior French officers in most of those various locations, if they'd just gone ashore or whatever and temporarily left their fleet in charge of the junior officers and the rank and file, those men almost certainly would have sailed their fleet out to become a very large Free French fleet to continue the fight against the Germans. And even amongst the senior-most officers, there were some who were very much in favour of that kind of thing. As I mentioned before, there was the whole incident where the Vichy French government was desperately flying out replacements for senior officers, both military and civil, down into Car, because they were terrified that if they didn't get someone in there ASAP, that Richelieu would just sail out and join the British. The only sort of toe I would dip into the political field of things is that my feeling, and again, this is a feeling because, not a political historian, I think that the perceived betrayal and affront of the British unilaterally concluding the Anglo-German naval agreement seems to have been far more keenly felt by the most senior French officers and French politicians, and sometimes in the case of people like Darlan, the line between politician and military officer was very, very blurred. And they seem to have taken that considerably more personally than perhaps professionally. And the further down the line you went, there may be some generic kind of, oh, well, what do you expect of them kind of feeling. But it doesn't seem to have very broadly translated down the line as into a general anti-British sentiment amongst the rank and file, certainly in the Marine Nationale. Explicitly Implicit asks, if naval projectiles were made with today's standards and measures, such as ballistic coefficients, length to width ratios, ERFB design, potential rocket-assisted propulsion, high muzzle velocities, etc., etc., what ranges are theoretically possible with battleship-sized shells? Well, almost anything, really. I mean, when you're talking about battleship-sized shells, there's an awful lot you can do. There's a reason I've got the picture of the harp guns here, because, I mean, ultimately, what is the harp gun? It's a couple of US Navy 16-inch guns stacked one on top of the other, bored out, and then fired, and you can literally fire a shot to pierce the heavens, i.e. this thing can fire a shell into space, or at least past the internationally defined boundary of space, i.e. more than 100 miles above the planet. At which point, given that this is not exactly modern technology, I mean, okay, it's perhaps 110 caliber gun is a little bit impractical for mounting on a battleship, but as you mentioned, there's a whole load of other stuff we can do with shells these days. But the main thing that I think, if you're going to try and put a theoretically possible maximum range on a battleship-sized shell from a practical battleship-sized cannon, you would have to draw a line of where does a shell go from being a shell to becoming a guided missile. Because you've got to remember, something like a harpoon missile is actually narrower. It's just over 13 inches wide, so it's actually narrower than a 16-inch gun barrel. So you could just make a gun-launched version of the harpoon missile. And, well, that's got a very, very long range. But you could make a 16-inch diameter missile, bigger than the harpoon, and fire that. And that would go, presumably, a very, very long distance, especially using modern tech. But at that point, you're using a battleship gun to fire a missile rather than a shell. But then if you do put rocket-assisted propulsion on it, if you do put a guidance package on it, well, at what point does the shell become not a shell but a missile? Because if you're going to fire, let's say, even a very basic modern ballistic designed projectile with some rocket-assisted propulsion, you're almost certainly going to be able to range out into the hundreds of miles quite comfortably. And realistically, at that point, it doesn't matter how precisely you aim your gun. You are not going to hit a target just through a simple ballistic arc at that kind of range, because there's far too many things that can interfere with the exact flight path on its route. At which point you need some kind of guidance system. But if you need a guidance system, you also need a way for the shell to enact what that guidance system is telling you, which means you need a control surface. And at that point, if you have rocket-assisted propulsion and control surfaces and a guidance package in the nose, well, haven't you just created a missile? Because that's effectively the same kind of principles that most modern air-to-air missiles use. Rocket burns out, coasts ballistically, guidance package, control surfaces, etc., etc. Ramjet missiles, somewhat different. They keep continuous power, but the majority of modern air-to-air missiles work that way, and we call them air-to-air missiles. So isn't that therefore also a missile? So yeah, you've got to make up your mind when does a shell become a missile, and if you want to keep it purely to, if you like, dumb fire, i.e. it's just going to go on a big ballistic arc and doesn't have control surfaces that pop out and so on and so forth, you have to accept at some point that if you're not going to guide the shell, you could achieve a truly stupid range with modern technology, but if it's just dumb fire, you might hit the county it's aimed at, and that's about it. Jellicoe Katz asks, why did we see the development of gas turbines for aircraft during the interwar period, but not the development of naval gas turbines? Wouldn't naval gas turbines be the next logical step after you develop steam turbines, the same way that jet engines are the next logical step once you've developed super and turbochargers? Would cutting out the boilers make energy transfer from fuel to motion sufficiently efficient to be attractive to a treaty-era capital ship? Well, interestingly, the gas turbine as a power-generating source actually is not that much younger than the diesel engine. It's around from the very end of the 19th century going into the early 20th century, but it faces a lot more challenges than the diesel engine in terms of efficiency, actually putting out more power than you need to put in. And once that's been overcome, there's a whole series of other challenges. Energy density and efficiency being one of them, much like diesel's faced. Just because you're generating more power than you're putting in doesn't necessarily mean it's all that efficient at doing it. And no, that's not breaking the laws of thermodynamics. That means you're just actually getting useful work out of the thing. But there are a whole load of specific engineering challenges related to power generating gas turbines, which means that they're much harder to implement than even jets. So one of those, from an engineering challenge, is what happens to the turbine blades themselves, sometimes called creeping by the blades. And this is essentially, you have a turbine blade, well, you have a bunch of them, considered one turbine blade. It's spinning around at extremely high speeds, so there's an awful lot of force being exerted on that blade. And naturally, it's going to want to elongate. Now, of course, a normal metal blade made out of a decent quality of steel or whatever alloy you want to use, it won't elongate unless you put a stupid amount of stress on it. Great, fine, fantastic. Unfortunately, when you're talking about a turbine environment, you are also talking about a huge amount of pressure and a huge amount of heat, and very much the heat, but also to a certain degree the pressure, reduces the overall resistance of the turbine blade, and it will begin to elongate. And if it begins to elongate all that much, it could break because your cross-sectional area is decreasing, therefore your strength is decreasing. The tip of the blade could hit the outside of the turbine casing, and that's not going to go very well. The blade itself could start to deform, lose efficiency, and start to experience greater resistance. You get blade flutter and all sorts of things. And on a jet engine, let's face it, that is ultimately about the size necessary to power an aircraft, this is slightly less of an issue because the overall turbine fan diameter is somewhat smaller. Therefore, the outer tip velocity, if for the same RPM, is going to be slightly less. And a given percentage of creep is going to obviously be physically a smaller amount. And for the technology of the time, it's just easier to make those somewhat smaller turbine blades. And even then, unless you have access to very specific materials, it's very difficult to do. Witness, German material shortages and how quickly their jet engines wore out at the end of the Second World War. On a much larger scale, like the scale you need to power a ship, this becomes a lot more difficult, and essentially it's beyond the technology of the 1930s to economically or realistically solve. Although, interestingly, you do get the very first gas turbines powering ships immediately after the Second World War, but obviously there's been a whole lot of advance in the technology during the Second World War. Now, there are, just before the Second World War, some early gas turbine power generating units, which is what you've seen on the screen here all the way through this question. However, they face a couple of restrictions. One, because they're land-based power units, they're built a lot more heavily, so essentially solving the problem of creep and other stresses and strains on the system by brute force, just overbuilding things, which obviously on a ship where you have a limited amount of displacement to go around, you don't necessarily want something that's not particularly energy dense compared to its mass. But also, even then, the power output was relatively small. So the power output, for example, of the first truly practical gas turbine power generator in the late 1930s was equivalent of about 5,000 to 5,500 horsepower, which, yeah, you know, on a ship that wants to move at any great speed, when you're talking about needing tens of thousands of horsepower minimum and hundreds of thousands if you're talking about a carrier or a battleship and you want to go past the mid-20s of knots, well, you need an awful lot of 5,000 horsepower turbines to do that. So better to just stick with the steam turbine tech, at that point at least. Zeranemy asks, about how much displacement did the aircraft facilities of treaty-era cruisers take up? Unfortunately, there's no general answer because there's a lot of variables to take into account. So you've got, for example, what type of aircraft? You know, how big is it? How heavy is it? That's going to affect things. And of course, how big and heavy the aircraft is going to affect how large a hangar you're going to need, if you're going to have a hangar at all. That, you know, not having a hangar is an option. It's also going to affect how heavy a catapult you need, because a bigger, heavier aircraft needs a bigger, heavier catapult. Also, a bigger and more capable aircraft might have more equipment associated with it. You know, it might be given depth charges on bombs that a lighter aircraft might not be, or might be given lighter versions of. How many aircraft are you going to have? How many catapults are you going to have for those aircraft? You know, a single light biplane on a light catapult with no hangar is going to use up considerably less displacement than two much larger aircraft, each with their own separate catapult and a fully enclosed hangar and all the equipment and armament to go with them, for example. And then, of course, you've got things like some of the US interwar heavy cruisers, which carry considerably more than 2 or 3 aircraft. And then, likewise, you've got the cranes to haul the aircraft back aboard, although sometimes you can lose that displacement in the fact that they can also be used as boat cranes, so not strictly purely aviation facilities. So you can run a huge gamut of displacement effects, but to give you some idea, the weight saving affected by removing aircraft and associated aircraft equipment from HMS Belfast during her wartime rebuild was recorded as having saved 190 to 200 tons, although of course they did retain the hangar structure, they just repurposed it. So something like an Arethusa class with one small biplane stuck on a catapult amidships and no real hangar facilities, you might be looking at a total effect in the high tens of tons. But something like a New Orleans class with 2 heavy catapults, 4 aircraft and hangar facilities, plus bombs and all of that and fuel storage, you might be looking at a couple of 100 tons or more. Coneled asks, in 53 Days on Starvation Island, there's an account of the Cactus Air Force taking out a Japanese convoy, which was apparently coming down the Solomon Islands via small craft and things of that nature. Could you provide some more details about this convoy? Unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you to be a little bit more specific. So in next month's Patreon Drydock, obviously now you get 2 questions. So you get a follow-up to this one and then whatever you want to ask next month. Simply because the Cactus Air Force attacked quite a few Japanese convoys, including a number that were made up largely of small craft. And, well, 53 Days on Starvation Island does actually cover quite a few of those various attacks. So unfortunately, the old meme of, do you have any idea how little that narrows it down? Yeah, the Cactus Air Force attacked several convoys which could match this description. So if you could give me a page number reference or a date reference, then I can tell you about that specific attack. That would be very much appreciated for next month. Thank you. Matt Kidd asks, did any German U-boats out on patrol toward the end of the war just try and kind of keep a low profile and not die when it was obvious the war was lost, but before the official surrender orders came down? And if so, how early was this sort of quiet quitting happening? I'm not directly aware of such occurrences. The problem is, if you look at the patrol reports, a lot of the patrol reports for U-boats in the last, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks of the war, so what that'd be March, April, May, a fair number of them are going out their way to find and attack enemy ships, regardless of how close it is to the end of the war. On the other hand, there are a bunch of U-boats that go out there who are out in similar areas for similar amounts of time who end up not attacking anything. Now, you could argue that perhaps these are examples of U-boats technically following their orders and going out to the relevant hunting grounds and then just going, yeah, stuff this, we're just hanging around till the surrender comes in. But equally, any number of U-boat patrols in the middle of the war came back without really having managed to attack anything. So whether or not those particular patrols represent a U-boat just deciding it's not going to really fight anymore and wait for the timeout, or whether it just represents a U-boat that's doing its best but just physically can't find anything to shoot at, is a little bit up in the air. And I haven't looked into the specifics of late war German U-boat activity in enough detail to be able to say with any degree of certainty whether those patrols represent people just chilling out or just being unlucky. But given human nature, I would probably anticipate that there were at least 1 or 2 U-boats who just decided to wait out the war. Jack von Kuhn asks, with regard to Fletcher-class destroyers, you mentioned in your video from the Bofors sales brochure, aka the Smarland, I think maybe? I don't know, that the US had basically paused destroyer design in favour of spam printing the Fletchers for the war effort. I'm wondering, what would have been a reasonable production run for the Fletchers if war doesn't break out? Obviously, it would not have been the well over 200 that were actually built, but how many Fletchers was the US Navy wanting to build before they moved on to their next design? Yeah, so once the Fletchers start being mass-produced, although the US is working on what will become the Allen M. Sumner design almost from the minute Fletcher's keel is being laid down, what they're doing is, if you look at US destroyer development during the 1930s, back then they were looking at mostly iterative and occasionally the odd innovative design, but essentially going, look, we're building this lot, we now have a fixed amount of time until we want to build the next lot of destroyers. That's when you've got to come up with a design. Whereas because of the mass production of Fletchers and then the ordering of even more Fletchers, when it came to the Sumners, they were essentially going, okay, well, we've got some time. We can sit back, not quite relaxed because there is a war on, but we can take a much wider range of views on what our next generation of destroyer is going to be, particularly with the whole issue of switching from single to twin mounts. In a dual-purpose arrangement, which is why there's this kind of gap between the keel laying of Fletcher and the keel laying of Allen M. Sumner relative to the gap between the keel laying of the Bensons and Gleaves and Sims and so on and so forth compared to their subsequent successors and then obviously the Fletchers. Now, as far as production run for the Fletchers, it's almost impossible to tell from initial sourcing because you have the problem that the Fletchers are ordered in a build-up to war environment and then a wartime environment. So there is never a kind of, here is our peacetime destroyer build program for the Fletcher class. And you can in fact even see that in the immediate predecessors, because when you look through most US interwar destroyer design, apart from the big flotilla leaders, you're mostly looking at an average of around 10 to a dozen destroyers per class. But the immediate predecessors to the Fletchers, they're ordered in 2 dozen to start with, and then they end up building something around 60 or so because of the war. So at a very minimum, given that the US was building up for a war, but if we said, for example, the US assumed they're not actually going to be involved in the war, but they're just going to continue rearming themselves, you might be tempted to go, oh, we'll take 24 as a baseline and say there would have been that many, and then perhaps they would have moved on to the Sumners or something similar to them. But the problem is that not only are the Fletchers the next generation of destroyers, they're also the first generation of destroyers that the US is designing that are pretty much free of treaty restrictions in terms of size and displacement. So they're much more capable than preceding designs. So I think they probably would have ordered considerably more than 24 just on general principle, because some of the earlier interwar period destroyers the US Navy was looking at going, we maybe want to replace those as well as expanding the fleet. So I think even if December 7th had never happened, you'd still be looking at, in the order of 4 to 6 dozen minimum being built before the Sumners come along. But that would assume a rather radical drawback on US destroyer construction, simply because the initial orders for the Fletchers were so high. You're essentially talking about a scenario where the US is absolutely convinced for some reason that they're not going to be involved actively in the war at any point in the near future. Christopher Dooley asks, torpedo boats were certainly influential. They resulted in huge expansions of capital ship and cruiser secondary and tertiary batteries. Whole new classes of ships were created just to deal with the threat, and the French built a whole naval strategy around them. But for all that, how successful were torpedo boats as a whole at their stated mission, i.e. attacking large warships with torpedoes? Well, as is probably getting fairly familiar, you have to put some qualifications on that, because what exactly do you count as a torpedo boat? There's the classic torpedo boat, the predecessor to the torpedo boat destroyer, but then you also have things like Italian Mars boats, CMBs, MTBs, Schnellboote, the Elbings, etc. All of these things are notionally torpedo boats, but I have a feeling that, given the context of what you're talking about with the Ginecol and so forth, you're probably referring to the small ships of the late 19th century, i.e. the things that would soon be superseded by torpedo boat destroyers. And in that realm, I would say there's a mixed amount of success. Some of it is a little bit difficult to determine, because very often torpedo boats were acting in concert with a larger fleet. So, for example, in the Sino-Japanese War, Japanese torpedo boats had a degree of success in their various assaults, but some of their assaults were damaging but not sinking assaults, and some of their assaults where the ship eventually did sink were either immediately before, immediately after, or in concert with more regular gunfire-based assaults from larger ships of the Japanese fleet. So in that context, if they made a hit, you could say that is a successful use, but then crediting which particular ship with the target actually sinking is a bit more difficult. Of course, the Japanese made extensive use of their torpedo boats in the Russo-Japanese War. Now, in terms of sheer numbers of ships sunk by Japanese torpedo boats in the Russo-Japanese War, you could say they weren't particularly successful because their total kill count is relatively low, but their total hit count, including ships damaged and ships sunk where they assisted, that's a lot higher. And then, of course, there's also the strategic effect. So, for example, the initial attacks on Port Arthur with torpedo boats. Okay, that's not massively successful in terms of actually permanently sinking lots and lots of Russian ships, but the strategic effect in all the damage, as well as with the occasional sinking, but a lot of the damage that they do, paralyzing the Russian efforts to respond in the initial portion of the war, allowing the Japanese to get the strategic initiative and so forth, that's a much bigger effect. And also, ultimately, these things are so cheap that they don't have to really sink or badly damage all that many large ships in order to, if you like, make their money back. I mean, the cost differential between a typical pre-dreadnought battleship and a medium-sized torpedo boat in the late 1890s is something in the order of 50 to 1. So if you end up buying 50 torpedo boats, but you only ever sink one battleship with them, even if that battleship sinks all of your torpedo boats in return, you've actually made your money back. Now, granted, a lot of torpedo boats were built, but if you narrow down that selection to just torpedo boats that were actually in service in a navy that went to war at the time that that navy actually went to war, and then you compare, number of torpedo boats in that category to number of ships that those torpedo boats sunk or badly damaged, and perhaps assign some arbitrary 25 or 50% value to the damaged ships, I think overall it breaks even or comes out in favour of the torpedo boats, at least in a lot of the earlier engagements. The problem, of course, is all the engagements where the torpedo boats either aren't present or can't do anything because of the sea state or the time spent at sea or various other factors. Jack Hirsch asks, could you give a rough overview of the Focke-achgelis I don't know, whatever, the FA-330, and how effective do you think they could have been if they'd been deployed in a more widespread scale on U-boats? So the FA-330, it's kind of a halfway house between a manned kite and an autogyro. As you can see, it looks kind of like a very skeletonized autogyro, but it doesn't have a motor. So, yeah, it's a kite-gyro. And the idea here is that as the U-boat goes forward, it obviously generates airflow, which causes the rotors to rotate, which makes the thing have lift, which means up it goes on the end of a cable, and now you have a nice overview of your surrounding area, and you can report back down to the U-boat that if there are any steamers nearby, which is all well and good. Now, if they'd been deployed more widely on U-boats, would they have been effective? Honestly, I don't think so. For one main reason, and that's time period. If German U-boats had had these things to hand right from the very start of the war, then I think there could have been a period, especially in the mid-Atlantic, where they might have been very useful. Unfortunately, by the time they're actually introduced in the middle of the war, Allied ships have plenty of radar, and there's also a fair degree of air cover, but the radar especially. And, well, yes, it's small, but at this point you're talking about radar that can pick up periscopes and snorkels. A somewhat larger thing with, that nice big flat tailplane and a bunch of massive rotating blades, that's going to show up on radar pretty darn easily. And of course, patrolling aircraft spotting it would also be a potential risk. And so deploying it on a more widespread scale, it's just going to make spotting the U-boats easier, and thus result in more sunk U-boats much faster. As I say, wind back to 1939-1940, when radar isn't quite as good and nowhere near as widespread, and there could be some utility, but for the time period it was introduced in, there's a reason the Germans didn't deploy it more widely. Prusi Antica asks, to keep technology from going into totally speculative realms when talking about alternate history, I often find it's assumed that the lessons of the previous war or various treaties were accepted as they were in our timeline. At the risk of oversimplifying things when it comes to the post-World War I period, the Washington naval treaties cut down all the post-Jutland battleship and battlecruiser programs, and the naval powers refocused their development on carriers and submarines as a result. My question is this: what is the smallest or economically least damaging war in an alternate history World War I scenario that a writer could get away with and still convincingly have both the interwar carrier and submarine developments, while also having a Jutland-type battle to teach the various lessons that would lead to the design of the G3s, the number 18s, etc., but without any subsequent treaties getting in the way? Would it still be a war between the major powers, or a proxy war that everyone plays observer in? Well, I think if you want all of those lessons, it's got to be a major war between major powers. And ultimately, if you're looking at the historical makeup of fleets in the early 1910s,
it's going to have to be a war that involves either Japan, Britain, or France, or some combination thereof, on at least one side, because they're the ones who are the leaders in carrier development at the start of historical World War One. If you don't involve at least one of them, then you're probably not going to get all that much in terms of naval air power lessons from the war that you're then going to fight. So, that could be America versus Japan. It could be a limited war between Germany and France. It could be a limited war between Italy and France. It could be a war between Britain and Germany, etc., etc. But you will need one of those three powers. Then, if you want to incorporate submarine developments, if you're trying to make it a limited war, i.e. you're not dragging in lots of other people, you are now having to, I think, eliminate Japan from that running, because World War I submarines just aren't long range enough for Japanese submarines to really do much other than coastal defense. And if they're fighting anyone, well, let's face it, they're probably going to be fighting the Americans. And the American submarines, they're not making it across to the Western Pacific. Sure, you might have a few based in the Philippines, but it's not going to be enough to learn significant lessons. So that leaves you with a war that involves at least Britain or France, because that'll give you both carrier and submarine developments of some description. And then you've got to have a Jutland-type battle. Well, that means you need a nation with a fairly large battle fleet, or at least a decent-sized battle fleet, and the enemy who can face off against them with a similar-sized battle fleet, or at least one that is not a complete one-sided walkover. At which point, you could technically look at a potential fight between France and Italy, although that would be pushing the lower end of things a little bit, because neither side has a particularly large battle fleet, and with them being so physically close to each other and sharing a land border, there's going to be a limited opportunity for submarine and especially carrier aircraft conflict when you can just have an aircraft conflict over your direct land border. And so I think at that point you are probably looking at a war that has to have Britain on one side at least. And at that point, realistically, there are only really two nations that you could plausibly go to war with and not have an immediate one-sided slaughter in the naval department once you've eliminated the nations that are allied with Britain anyway. So you'd be looking at a limited war between either Britain and America or Britain and Germany. And the Germans have the larger fleet of the two potential opponents. They're a lot closer, so again, you can have an actual submarine war, whereas you could have a submarine campaign in a war against the US, but it would be a bit weird because it would essentially mostly be a localized submarine war off the Canadian coast and in the Caribbean, and potentially off the US coast if the British haul some of their submarines by tow rope across the Atlantic. Although, with battle fleets ranging out across the Atlantic, there is some reasonable capacity for early carrier aircraft, or, well, seaplane carriers like Campania and Engadine to prove their worth. But honestly, a Jutland-style engagement between the British and American fleets is mostly just going to go the way of, shockingly, the much larger fleet with an actual cruiser screen won, because, well, the US fleet doesn't have a cruiser screen, so they don't have scouts, at which point any potential naval engagement is going to lead with British battle cruisers and cruisers identified where the US fleet was. They then held them at a distance until various torpedo attacks could be completed, and then the British battle fleet was able to engage from a position of strength, which that's not exactly rocket science or going to lead to any kind of Jutland-style revelations. So essentially, the smallest and least economically damaging war that's going to give you all of these lessons is probably going to be maybe a year and a half long war between Germany and Britain for some reason. Maybe somehow France manages to sit it out, making it primarily a naval operation, because that will give you long enough for the U-boat campaign to take effect, as well as various countermeasures to begin to be developed. Development will start on them. So that'll give you most of your submarine lessons. The British will, let's say, be able to use early seaplane carriers relatively effectively in things like raids on German Zeppelin sheds, safeguarding the fleet from Zeppelins, and maybe scouting German forces. So you can kind of go with that. And both fleets are big enough, especially in 1914-15, to have a big knockdown, drag-out Jutland-style naval battle, which you can take those lessons away from. But given that it's a primarily sea-based conflict, with Britain presumably following its old wartime rules of gobbling up all the colonies, and maybe Japan getting in on the action as well because they want a few of Germany's Pacific colonies, then you could conclude with maybe Germany suing for peace in late 1915 on the grounds that, well, without a major land war to fight, they haven't got any major victories to point to, and if they've lost a bunch of their colonies and not gotten the better of a Jutland-style engagement, there's not a whole lot they can do at that point, because Britain will have an even tighter economic blockade on them, and unless they want to sail out and lose another big naval fight, they can just slowly sit there and die of starvation while Britain absorbs pretty much the entire German overseas empire. So that would be a war of a scale where you could theoretically just about get the various lessons that you get from historical World War II in, even if you would have to do a little bit of finagling to cram them all into a year and a half or so. But the scale of the navies and the operational theatres is there just enough to maybe get them to occur. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, could you explain your position with respect to the sinking of HMS Victoria, especially when it's realised that there were two other near collisions? The known reluctance of junior officers to question orders would have been precisely why such an order should not have been given. Also, apart from the manoeuvre itself, what is the justification for the short distance between the ships? I've always felt like this incident was so poorly conceived it could only be explained if Commander Seymour had given the offending orders from the deck of the Kamchatka. My personal interpretation of the whole thing is essentially that Tryon was, not intending the pun, but trying to engender such a colossally, obviously inept, obviously due to lead to disaster circumstance that his men couldn't possibly do anything else but think for themselves to preserve their own lives apart from anything else, and, therefore show some initiative. Tryon was not an inexperienced commander. If you look at his record in fleet exercises and so forth, he was a very, very able admiral, probably one of the best the Royal Navy had at the time. And interestingly, when you look at how he conducts his fleets in the various naval exercises, there is a consistent theme of he has an overall plan. He tells everyone what his overall plan is, but he splits up his forces in such a way that various officers that are his subordinates have to think for themselves in order to properly execute his plan, because he tells them what he wants them to do, but by putting them off on their own in a detached unit, it means they are forced to respond to the enemy as the enemy responds to them, and they can't reference back to Tryon. So there's this consistent theme throughout all of his service as a flag officer of desperately trying to beat into his subordinates' heads that you do occasionally have to think for yourself and modify or discard orders when they are too dangerous. Now, that would be a good working theory for the incident, but the thing that tips it over from Tryon somehow massively screwed up in a way that he'd never shown any inclination to before, over to this was a deliberate attempt on his part to force people to stop and actually, disregard orders for a change, is from a memo that he put out to his fleet. So, bearing in mind, if you are part of the Mediterranean fleet at the time, you know what Tryon's reputation is. Some of the officers have served with him in the past in various roles. You know you're going on to manoeuvres, and then you get this memo circulated to everybody. And to quote it mostly in full, orders directing the movement of ships, either collectively or singly, are invariably accompanied, as a matter of course, with the paramount understood condition, with due regard to the safety of Her Majesty's ships. When the literal obedience to any order, however given, would entail a collision with a friend or endanger a ship by running on shore or in any other way, paramount orders direct that the danger is to be avoided, while the object of the order should be attained if possible. So, put into context of everything Tryon's done up till now, if I was a captain in the Mediterranean fleet and I get this memo from that admiral just before we sail on fleet exercises, that's near enough as I can possibly think of the single biggest red flag of Tryon going, hey guys, in the following set of maneuvers, I'm going to order you to do something which will probably result in a collision if you are stupid enough to do exactly what I tell you to. And I'm also giving you the perfect out because I'm giving you pre-written instructions that if you think my orders are going to make you crash into something, you should not follow them. If you can follow the spirit of the orders, great, but it's not necessary. The main thing is don't hit things. That's essentially what he's saying in this memo. And then he deliberately tightens up the formation so that there isn't a safety margin in the ship's turning radii. He sends the fleet heading towards shore, so there is a time limit on when people can do things. And he leaves people with options open in the wording of the orders when he orders the two columns to turn. You know, they could try and turn to keep both columns at the appropriate sides, or they could try and turn through the formations. The one thing that they shouldn't be doing at that point is literally following his orders and the standard method of turning, because that is the one thing that will lead to a collision. Basically, if you do anything except for follow orders and tradition literally and blindly, you'll be fine. If you follow orders and standard naval practice literally and blindly, you will collide. And yeah, based particularly on that memo as well as everything else, the only reasonable conclusion I can come to is that Tryon was essentially baiting people and saying, look, I'm going to put you in an impossible situation if you follow my orders, but I've explicitly told you not to if I do that. Now break my orders and show me that you actually have some form of intelligence in that skull of yours. And they're sorely disappointed when they just follow his orders quite literally and slam into the flagship. Stafford Magnus asks, in episode 345 you answered a question regarding tank turrets on ships and mentioned that guns that are designed for tanks are much more prone to rust at sea than a sea service weapon. By this, do you mean that guns that are going to be used on ships often have different metallurgical properties than land-based guns, i.e. do gun manufacturers add more chromium or molybdenum or whatever alloying metals are needed in order to inhibit rust? And or did you mean that naval guns receive far more attention by way of painting, oiling and other waterproofing or rust-proofing activities? A mixture of the two. So there will be considerably more general maintenance on guns at sea than there are guns on land, but also the treatments will differ. So, you know, for example, the paint that you will use. Now, obviously you don't want a paint that's going to run the minute it gets touched by a spot of rain, but paint that you could use on land-based artillery only needs to be rain resistant. You know, it's only really got to put up with being occasionally drenched in the odd downpour. Whereas at sea, not only is it more likely that your guns are going to be rained upon because they're not going to be spending time in covered sheds and so forth when they're not on active duty, but also there's going to be sea spray and a lot of obviously saltwater environment, which is going to be a lot harsher on paint. So you need a different kind of paint to better withstand those kinds of things. And yes, there is actually going to be, on the other hand, somewhat different metallurgy going on. Now, obviously, there's only a certain number of alloys that you can use in early 20th century artillery, without sacrificing something by way of either massively increased costs or decreased durability and so on and so forth. But there are some variants on alloys. Obviously, steel is an alloy, but additional alloy materials added to steel. And some of those are more commonly used at sea because they might be a little bit more expensive, but again, saltwater environment, regular exposure to water and other, chemicals in seawater, therefore you're going to want to pay that little bit extra for the more rust-resistant metals. And it's not just the gun, it's all the mountings, the turntables, etc., both in terms of the sealant and the treatment of them and the materials they're made of. And it can go even further. So, for example, when you come to submarines, you will have submarine-rated weapons, and ostensibly they might be similar. So taking the US, for example, you might have a 5-inch 25 or a 5-inch 38 on a sub, but a specifically designed submarine issue 5-inch 25 or 5-inch 38 will be a little bit different from one that you would find on a carrier, like here, for example. Usually there'll be a lot greater amounts of chrome involved, for example, chrome linings, etc., because that kind of gun is going to spend a good chunk of its career actually submerged in the water, not just being soaked by spray from the water. So submarine mounted guns have to go through a whole extra stage of preservation treatments and materials, even more than surface-based guns do, which in turn are going through more materials choices and more preservative choices and maintenance choices than land-based guns are. Gallias of Martinengo ask, what is the highest altitude from which an aircraft has scored a hit on a ship at sea with unguided bombs? It's a little bit difficult because quite often, well, I say quite often, in the rare circumstances that a ship at sea has actually been hit by level bombers, i.e. a ship that's in some way, shape or form manoeuvring, it's surprisingly difficult to find what altitude those bombers were actually at, other than high. And then you can kind of infer roughly what altitude they should have been at from that respective nation's pre-war attack profiles. But obviously that only gives you a range of where they theoretically should have been. It doesn't actually strictly tell you what altitude the aircraft was actually at, or, whether they were even following procedure at that point. And trying to work it out from the flight logs, if they exist still, and if you can find them, is still harder, because obviously a lot of the time level bombing crews would report hitting something when in fact they hadn't hit anything. So my sort of thumb in the air and maybe chance by arm estimate would probably be the hit on the Mutsuki, which I estimate, based on the surrounding reports, was probably done at 10 to 11,000 feet. And, okay, fair enough. Mutsuki was barely moving, but she was still moving. But I would reckon is probably in the competition for highest altitude of a ship that was underway in some way, shape or form, being hit by an aircraft using an unguided weapon. So not a Fritz X, because that's a guided bomb, not Arizona, because she wasn't moving, etc., etc. But I suspect that those who are far more versed in aviation history than myself might have a little bit more information to offer. My mum's basement needs more windows asks, the US Navy famously determined that the Japanese designation AF referred to Midway Island, and so was able to position its carriers in an optimal position to sink the 4 fleet carriers that Japan had dedicated to the operation. But it seems a bit strange that the Japanese would use Roman characters rather than something from their own orthography to designate targets. Did they in fact do so, and if so, why? You do come across this a fair bit, where you've got things like Operation C, Operation MO, Target AF, etc. But you've got to remember a few things. Firstly, the full Japanese language, at least in the radio transmission capabilities of the period, couldn't really be enciphered and coded. So they had to develop a essentially Romanized version of Japanese to encipher and transmit with Morse code and so forth anyway. So at that point, they're already using Roman characters to a greater or lesser extent. And then if you use, since you're already using those characters, if you use Roman characters, which most Japanese naval officers will have learned at some point or other, given the time point in history that they're at that stage, then not only do they not really mean anything in Japanese, thus increasing operational security internally, but because you're just using Roman characters, theoretically, to somebody who is reading your message who doesn't know what it refers to, it doesn't give away any clues, because if you're using your own language, there might be the temptation to adopt a code name for a given operation that's an oblique reference or clue to either what the operation's going to be or what target you're going after, etc., etc. And given that Japanese is a relatively descriptive and poetic language, that actually increases the risk even more so than it would with a English language transmission. And of course you could have randomly generated names, which becomes very much a thing in the Cold War for the NATO powers. But the Japanese just decided, well, if we just use single letters or letter pairings from the Roman alphabet, they could mean anything. There is no contextual clue within that reference as to what it could possibly mean. And that, as I said, that increases operational security quite a bit. And it's only when you have thoroughly compromised the code system that you can actually start to guess what these things mean. And even then, you can actually see the operational security fully working, because the Americans had compromised the Japanese code, so they knew that the Japanese were looking at this target AF, but because it was so completely and utterly divorced from any kind of contextual clue, they didn't know what AF was. So they had to set up this whole deception of saying Midway's run out of water, putting that in open radio traffic, and then looking for when the Japanese say, oh yes, AF has run out of water. And they're like, right, therefore AF must refer to Midway. But they've essentially had to force the Japanese to provide a contextual clue to them. At least that's my understanding of things. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School Training Vessel Harakaze asks, in period set films, some TV shows, and an awful lot of naval fiction, cutting out expeditions seem to happen with the Royal Navy almost always coming out with at least one ship, if not several. When was the last time such an activity was done by a naval crew, not counting the Granville raid by the Germans at the end of World War II? It is difficult to determine because traditionally a cutting out operation involves sending over a boatload of your men separate from your main ship to kind of sneakily row up to an enemy warship, or merchant ship for that matter, then board it, capture it, and either tow it or sail it away. And that does become more difficult as ships become larger and steam-powered. So you then start to see towards the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries cutting out operations referring to sudden descents upon an enemy ship by a warship, which then leads to the enemy crew abandoning ship and that ship then being captured. So in that spirit, you could perhaps look at something like the capture of the weather ship Lauenburg in World War II, as seen here from the viewpoint of a boarding crew from HMS Tartar. That's described in a number of naval history books as a cutting out operation, although Tartar is a lot more actively involved than perhaps would be the case in a classic Age of Sail cutting out operation. You could argue, for example, that the Finns taking over a bunch of the Russian Baltic fleet is sort of a cutting out operation, except they don't have motherships to start with, but they do obviously after they've finished capturing them. So it really depends on how you define cutting out operation. John Plate asks, in the previous Drydock, you mentioned that Germany could do well with a carrier gunship hybrid in the Atlantic, and that got me thinking. I've always thought the Tone-class heavy cruisers from the Japanese Navy would work well in the Atlantic. They're fast and could probably absorb destroyer and light cruiser grade gunfire, perhaps switching out the 8-inch guns with some 6-inch and adding more float planes would work. I know they're only float planes, but the British were using biplanes, so could you imagine they'd work out? As far as ships with offensive potential in Atlantic raiding scenarios go, the Tonneys aren't a half-bad choice. As you said, they're pretty darn quick. I personally would retain the 8-inch gun battery because the British do escort some convoys with heavy cruisers, so you will want that 8-inch gun battery to counter them. And, of course, it gives you a firepower advantage over the convoys that are escorted by just 6-inch or smaller ships. You've also got 5-inch dual-purpose guns, you've got torpedo tubes, so, you can keep yourself safe from most threats, at least long enough to run away, given that you can do 35 knots if there's a big threat out there. And you've also got, as I said, torpedoes to finish off targets if you don't want to expend shells, or vice versa. My only concerns with using the Tonnay, or something very, very similar to it, in the Atlantic environment is, of course, it doesn't have any radar, at least not in the early part of the war. So if it's going to be used by, let's say, Germany, if Japan builds a couple of extras and sells them to Germany, you are going to have to outfit it with radar. The other thing is that although it has a large float plane complement, as you can see here, there's no hangar for them. They're all just stuck out there at the back. In the Atlantic, I don't think those float planes are going to last very long, unfortunately. Rough seas, weather, etc., you're probably going to end up with a lot of those aircraft inoperable in, relatively speaking, short order. Also, being that they're Japanese scout float planes, they don't really have all that much offensive firepower at all compared to a cruiser carrier of the kind that I was describing in that previous Drydock. So they might struggle a little bit. For as long as the float planes, or at least a float plane, remains operational, that extra recon range will be very, very useful for a Tonnay or Tonnay type cruiser. But if you, say, moved some of the catapults even further aft, built a big hangar space, and carried maybe 4 aircraft instead of 5 or 6 or more, you would get, I think, a lot more use out of them. And of course, with a cruiser carrier, as opposed to a catapult-armed cruiser like this, you can get heavier payloads so the aircraft can actually do some attacking. Kyla Stern asks, "You're very vocal about your dislike for MacArthur. However, the general perception of him as a general seems to be very positive as far as I can tell. Is this a case of him being a good flag officer on land but bad in a naval context, a good tactician but bad strategist, or is he just overhyped in some circles? Or is it something else entirely?" MacArthur seems to be one of those people who, in the UK, we might call him a Marmite character. Oh, okay, you either love him or hate him, and there is nothing in between. And as far as I can tell, that seems to be just as much the case for land-based historians as naval-based historians. The land-based historians that I've seen discussing MacArthur or writing books about MacArthur, they're either very much in favour of him, at least in a World War II context, or they are kind of almost Spanish Inquisition levels against him. And neither side has much polite to say about the other. And I've gotten a few extensive, and to be fair, well-written, if somewhat angry emails about my perceptions of MacArthur. But be that as it may, obviously, as I said before, I'm not a land-based historian, so I leave the land-based historians to argue about MacArthur's specific capabilities as a general. I think his capabilities in the Korean War are somewhat more decidedly against. But again, that's my reading of what the land-based historians seem to think. But when it comes to looking at his actions purely from a naval standpoint, he, even if we assume that he is an okay to good or even brilliant land commander, he is absolutely not really any good at all in the naval field of things. Which, to be fair, that's not exactly surprising. He is an army officer. You can't exactly expect him to have a full and comprehensive grasp of naval tactics and strategy. But if I was to boil down my kind of objections to MacArthur into two main categories, it'll be one, he consistently seems to completely fail to understand exactly how naval amphibious operations work. Now, as I said, you can't really expect him to fully understand carrier battles and this kind of thing, but given that it directly involves troops, he should at least have some understanding of how amphibious operations, especially opposed amphibious operations, should work and what is and isn't plausible. A classic example of that is, in the run-up to the Guadalcanal campaign, the US Navy, in part, ends up committing itself to the Guadalcanal campaign to head off MacArthur's continued insistence that they round up what meager amphibious forces the US has at that point and throw them at Rabaul, which, if you think the Dieppe raid was bad, a 1942 Rabaul amphibious assault would be one of the nastiest slaughters of attacking troops in the entire campaign. I mean, it would make the Crete operation for the casualties suffered by the Fallschirmjäger look like a walk in the park. And the other thing that I think I would generally hold against him is simply the fact that, mostly through his ego, he ended up forcing the US to split the Pacific Theater into separate operational areas just so he could have an area to go and play in and be in command of. And that causes no end of tension as he's constantly, well, for obvious reasons, trying to absorb as many resources as possible into it. And so Nimitz, as you can see here, Nimitz with MacArthur, is constantly trying to feed him enough forces, at least on a temporary basis, to actually accomplish the net goal of the US as a whole, while also keeping them on a relatively short leash so that MacArthur can't just squirrel them away somewhere or send them off on some harebrained lunatic scheme or completely sideline the central and western theatre of the Pacific, which he's constantly trying to do. Objectively speaking, given that, with the exception of New Guinea, because it's such a massive, large island, the vast majority of the Pacific campaign is primarily a naval campaign. You've got to establish control of the sea, you've got to transport things across the sea, and then you fight for control of specific islands and atolls in order to further your logistical network and control of the sea until you get to Japan. If you're approaching it from a purely rational perspective, the vast majority of the Pacific campaign should have been a grand, organized naval campaign where the Navy delivers the Army and the Marines to the agreed upon targets. You do need, obviously, to consult with the land forces, given that you're putting them ashore on various islands to fight and, in many cases, die. But what you end up with is a somewhat imperfect system where you have a primarily army-based and army-thinking-led campaign in the Southwest Pacific, and then the Western and Central Pacific is being Navy-led, and all the tensions that go along with that. If MacArthur had wanted to be the supreme land general for the broader Pacific campaign, but obviously subordinate to Nimitz overall directing said campaign, and then you've got the Joint Chiefs directing both Nimitz and MacArthur, that could have been a working arrangement, depending on what you think of MacArthur's land generalship skills. Doesn't necessarily have to be MacArthur, but that kind of arrangement could work in principle. But MacArthur was so determined that he should be the one in charge that we end up with these two, not quite, but almost separate theatres. Jack von Kuhn asks, if HMS Repulse survives, but Prince of Wales does not, and then after the fall of Singapore, Repulse is ordered to Pearl Harbor to be on long-term loan to the US Navy, what upgrades would the US Navy do to her, and how would she be used? For some in the US Navy, the arrival of Repulse on an extended duration loan to the US Navy would be kind of skipping for joy time, because you now have a large capital ship that is fast enough to actually legitimately and fully keep up with your aircraft carriers, so you have a nice big escort that can go anywhere with the carriers at full speed and can 1v1 a Congo fairly comfortably. Now, granted, there's only one of her and there's 4 Congos, but it's a step in the right direction. Now, this has advantages for many reasons. Obviously, the tactical flexibility of being able to match speed with the carriers, but also the fact you can now perhaps afford to detach some of your other fast capital ships if you need to for other purposes. But the big restriction that you've got with Repulse, apart from the fact you probably want a little bit more fuel in her, is that she's a relatively old ship and, unlike Renown, hasn't been recently fully upgraded. So she is going to need a bunch of additional systems, and sooner rather than later, ideally. Now, the good news is that Repulse, in her last few months of life historically, did receive some Type 284 gunnery radar, so you don't have to worry necessarily too much about that side of things, but you probably want to slap an SG radar on there for general surface search, and probably a US Navy air search radar as well. The main guns, fine, you can leave those. You can get 15-inch shells off the British. It's not exactly like they're short of them. Armour-wise, she has been upgraded during the war, so while her belt and deck armour aren't fantastic, anything to write home about, they are good enough if you're going to use her in a fast carrier-Congo fighting role. The biggest issue is going to be her secondary battery. She's still got those awful triple 4-inch and a handful of anti-aircraft 4-inch. Now, yes, the US does have some 4-inch guns in storage, but ultimately it's probably a fairly quick and easy job to just go, you know what, we're gonna quickly pop you over to Bremerton. We're gonna rip off all of these ridiculous 4-inch guns and pretty much anything else that isn't a 15-inch gun or the handful of 20mm Oerlikons she just received. And we're gonna, given that this would be the beginning of 1942, we're just going to slap on a bunch of 5-inch 38s and maybe a bunch more Oerlikons and call it a day. Maybe stick a couple of fire control systems for the 5-inch guns in as well. That would be a relatively quick and easy refit. You can probably get that done by stripping off the pre-existing stuff and not really change the overall weight all that much. So you're not going to need to worry about bulges and all this other kind of stuff. Maybe introduce additional fuel storage in the double bottom if you've got a little bit of extra time on your hands to get, as I said, give her a bit more range. And you can get Repulse, I think, back in the water well enough in time for at least Midway, if not possibly even running escort on Yorktown and Lexington at Coral Sea. And bear in mind, you don't necessarily have to have twin 5-inch 38s. You could have single 5-inch 38s. You could even be using 5-inch 25s. Just, some kind of rapid-firing US 5-inch dual-purpose or anti-aircraft gun system, wholesale replacing the 4-inch. And I think, to be honest, that would probably be the extent of her upgrades in US Navy service if she's on just a long-term loan. She'd probably receive more 20mm and some 40mm Bofors as time went on. But in terms of major overall changes, apart from maybe the installation of a CIC and possibly the suppression of some or most of her aircraft handling facilities, I think that's probably all you'd see. If she was permanently in US Navy service, then as newer fast capital ships come online and some of the standards go through their refits, you might see her sent back for a major refit in late 43, early 44 to completely overhaul her superstructure as well, but I don't think the US would willingly pay for that if she's just a long-term loan. Duke Master asks, you've mentioned many times how the 42-pounder was just a bit too big for one man to load or reload, and how 10-inch caliber guns ended up being worse than the guns immediately above and beneath them in caliber in terms of general handling and capability. What are other examples of similar unhappy calibers? Well, there's a lot of different ones across history, but if you're looking at, let's say, the pre-Dreadnought to end of the World War II period, the Age of Steel, I suppose you could call it, then essentially, if you want to find an unhappy caliber, look at the navy in question and then try and determine what their general rule for gun upgrade is. Because the vast majority of navies will tend to either work in 2-inch or 1.5-inch increments. And it doesn't have to be every single increment they introduce a caliber, but you can usually see multiples thereof. So, for example, the British, if you're looking at heavy warship guns, so cruisers and upwards, you've got 6-inch, then you've got 7.5-inch, then you've got 9.2-inch, which is almost another 1.5 increase. Then you go, in theory, you should go to sort of 10.5-ish, 10.5, 11 inches, but they don't. But they do go to 12, which from 9.2 is, okay, it's technically a 2.8 caliber, a 2.8 inch increase, but it's almost 2 1.5s. And then they go to 13.5, and then they go to 15. And that's the natural progression. They do look at 16.5, in case you're wondering, during the chain of development that will end up with the G3s. And interestingly enough, 18-inch from 15-inch is, again, it's a 3-inch increase. That's two 1.5s. And then you look at something like the Americans, and, well, they go 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch for some of their armor cruisers, 12, 14, 16, and contemplate 18. Now, once you've worked out your navy in question's choice of progression of caliber, now you can look into things that fall outside of that, and you're almost guaranteed to find unhappy calibers. The only exception to that being if a navy in question moves over from one system to the other, mostly as a result of a treaty requirement. So, for example, the Royal Navy does end up going for 16-inch guns and 8-inch guns on their capital ships and heavy cruisers, respectively, mostly because of the naval treaty system. And that also, to a certain degree, forces the choice of 14-inch gun on the King George V's, but there's a whole other slew of issues for that, which we can look at another time. And the general rule that you're looking at, the reason why navies have these incremental but fairly regular upgrades in caliber, is that what a navy tends to be looking for is an increase in penetrative power, ideally range, but also broadside weight, such that while the weight of the guns is increasing, therefore on a similar size hull, meaning you're going to be able to have fewer of them, when you have those fewer guns, you still have more capacity. So heavier broadside, longer range, better penetration, etc., etc. And because of the square cube law, amongst others, it's that our favourite law again, then it ends up being that when you factor in, other things like rate of fire and such like, anything that falls outside of your incremental path tends to not work out very well. Now, the interesting thing is, outside of second-class battleships in the 1890s and the US armoured cruisers in the early 1900s, virtually no one really wants to touch the 10-inch gun and surrounding areas for much the same reason as almost nobody touches a 7-inch gun, with the exception of the Soviets, and so on and so forth, because they're very awkward in that whatever is below them tends to have some significant advantage over whatever is above them. So in the case of a 7-inch gun, the 6-inch gun, although it is less powerful, it has a considerably higher rate of fire than the 8-inch gun. In the case of the 10-inch gun, the 7.5, 8, 8.2, 8.3, 9.2 inch all have, generally speaking, better rates of fire and or considerably less weight than an 11 or a 12-inch gun. And the same thing for a 17-inch gun, which occasionally you see mooted in some places. It's the 15 and 16-inch calibers directly below it have good firepower, but also a regular battleship rate of fire. The 18.1 or 18-inch above it has much, much more firepower, but a big drop in fire rate. And then these, so let's take our 17, 10-inch and 7-inch calibers. These awkward, unhappy calibers they don't have enough of the bigger calibers advantages, and they tend to lose most of the smaller calibers advantages as well. So, for example, a 7-inch gun, at least as implemented by the Soviets, has at best the fire rate of an 8-inch gun, but nothing of the firepower. So you've lost the rate of fire from the 6-inch, but you haven't really gained a huge amount in penetrative power, range, or broadside weight. Same with the 10-inch gun. Compared to cruiser guns, it's slow firing, almost as slow firing as a battleship gun, if not just as slow firing, but doesn't carry anywhere near the destructive capability or penetration capability of a battleship gun. And with the 17-inch gun, if, again, you look up the stats of the few that were vaguely considered, and you tend to find that they have the same kind of drop in overall rate of fire that an 18-inch gun experiences, but only marginally better performance than a 16-inch gun, for example. Real MCB asks, considering the importance of Operation Pedestal, why is Admiral Syfret still relatively obscure in World War II naval history? I think there's multiple reasons, and I think this is actually, relatively speaking, to varying degrees, somewhat applicable across all the Malta convoys. Firstly, there are a lot of Malta convoys. You have Harpoon and Vigorous, as well as Pedestal, and a few other big ones as well. And they tend to get kind of lumped together as the Malta convoys a lot of the time. And because obviously each convoy tends to have different commanders, no one's really picked one and gone, this is the one that we're going to say, lionize, I guess, I suppose. Another factor is that when you're talking about the Malta convoys, like most convoys, you have a heavy escort commander, if you like, and a close escort commander. In this case, Syfret is in charge of the big warship escort, but Burrows is in charge of the close escort. Whereas in a lot of big naval engagements, there is one admiral who is above all. He is the one in charge of the whole fleet. So the traditional kind of he was the man in charge, therefore he's the one who gets the glory, is a little bit harder to do with convoys, especially something like Pedestal. Then you have another problem, which is that exactly what happens in Pedestal in terms of who succeeds and who doesn't succeed, and whether each of these successes or losses is a good or a bad thing, is completely all over the shop for a very long time after World War II. Now, of course, everybody who has their own opinion on Pedestal is going to say, well, obviously my opinion is correct. But the simple fact is we have to acknowledge almost everybody who's heard of Pedestal in any great detail probably has a slightly different view on the overall balance of success versus failure as compared to anyone else. The Italians on a tactical level were pretty happy with their performance. The Luftwaffe was on a tactical level relatively happy with its performance. But, and again, this also comes into the discussion of tactics versus strategy, because tactically speaking, the Pedestal convoy took horrible losses. But strategically speaking, they were still able to resupply Malta. And you even see this in internal Italian and German documents where, some admirals or air marshals or whatever are saying, look at how many ships we destroyed. And other officers from the same service are going, yeah, but you didn't get all the relevant ones because Malta's still there. Malta's been resupplied. And that is going to cause a whole load of problems well in excess of any losses we might have suffered carrying out the attacks on the convoy in the next weeks and months, which turns out to be somewhat prophetic. And because there isn't a single major battle to point at, even with PQ-17, there's a couple of pretty big actions to point to. And with most naval engagements, you can point out, look, here was a load of big guns shooting at each other, and this was a key point or the key point. Whereas with Pedestal, it's days upon days upon days upon days of air raids and submarine attacks. And there isn't kind of one climactic engagement where, the heavy escorts are shooting at the German or Italian ships and that this is how the whole thing is decided. It just doesn't happen with Malta convoys. And so you end up overall with this kind of slightly confused picture of what the heck's going on, who's responsible, was it good, was it bad, who won, who lost, was there a tactical victory but a strategic loss, or a strategic victory and a tactical loss? And in all of that, the people who are in charge of it kind of get a bit lost. Although I have decided that when I cover Pedestal, I already know what the title of the video is going to be, and I already know one particular metric I'm going to use within it. So yeah, the title of my eventual video on Pedestal, and obviously the other wonderful thing is this can work as either a single title or a two-part title if I have to split it into two. I'm going to take the Salamander's motto, unto the fires of battle, into the fires of battle, unto the anvil of war, because it's so appropriate for Pedestal. And in terms of the air assault that they're suffering, I'm going to use midways as my count. So basically I'm going to total up how many aircraft were involved in attacking one side or the other. I haven't quite decided which side at midway. And then I'm going to use that as a metric. So, by this point along the convoy has suffered 3 midways worth of attacks. And you'd be surprised how many midways worth of attacks poor old Pedestal has to endure. Scott Jennings asks, in the age of steam and steel, there were a few ship classes that were particularly massive examples of their type, such as destroyers that almost qualified as small cruisers, or cruisers that approached the size of capital ships. In your opinion, at the start of each world war, what was the maximum practical displacement that a ship of a given type could have and still be considered a member of that type, discounting any arbitrary outside restrictions such as those imposed by treaty? And what would a displacement above that limit, or why would a displacement above that limit be impractical for a ship of that type? And are there any ship types for which that limit would be different at the end of its respective world war due to wartime technological development or other factors? I think there's definitely movement in both world wars as to what counts as a particular ship type. So, for example, at the start of World War I would argue that anything much above maybe 13 to 1400 tons is probably a small cruiser of some description, because the average destroyer is still in the high hundreds of tons, and there are some considerably smaller than that, one or two a bit larger. Towards the end of the war, you'll have the Wicks and Clemsons, which are over 1,000. But you also have a number of 1890s era cruisers, which granted no one's using on the front lines, but they are still around in second line roles and such, which aren't even breaking 2,000 tons. So you can very rapidly approach the low end of cruiser at that stage. At the upper end of cruiser, at least in World War I, it's quite a difficult one because, of course, you have armoured cruisers, which in some cases can be physically larger and occasionally even displace more than some battleships, but are not battleships because, obviously, they are emphasising speed against protection and firepower. And, of course, the armoured cruiser then goes on to evolve into the battle cruiser, which is definitely a capital ship. And the line between armoured cruiser and battle cruiser, you could argue, is based partly on speed, although armoured cruisers are getting faster and faster anyway. I mean, if you want to be very, very technical, you could point to things like Blücher and Rurik and go, okay, well, I'm going to draw an arbitrary line and say 16,000 tons is the cutoff for being an armoured cruiser, and above that you're a battle cruiser, which can look a little bit neat because just above that tonnage limit is the Invincible. But honestly, if you look at the size and capabilities of Rurik, Blücher, and Invincible side by side, if you gave Invincible 9.2-inch guns, but you gave Blücher or Rurik 12-inch guns, or I suppose 11-inch guns for Blücher, despite them displacing a little bit less, you'd have a pretty solid argument for your more heavily gunned Rurik and Blücher being battle cruisers and Invincible being a really big armoured cruiser, because it's mostly about the firepower at that point rather than the displacement. And, of course, you're well north of a considerable number of pre-dreadnoughts in terms of displacement at that point, which, it throws everything out an awful lot. I think in World War I, you're probably better off looking at overall number and caliber of guns as an indicator rather than specifically displacement, just because of the weird and wonderful nature of all the different types of ships. Whereas in World War II, thanks in part to the regulation of the treaties, and in part just to the overall increase in size of ships and the, relatively speaking, streamlining of types, there is a little bit more of a differentiation to be made. So for the Second World War, it's very difficult, I think, when it comes to destroyers, because broadly speaking, my first instinct would be to say that a destroyer should cap out around 2,200, 2,300 tons going into World War II. The problem is you then have things like the Mogadors, which are nearly 3,000 tons. And they're in a weird space because most of the time people acknowledge that, yes, they are destroyers. They're very large destroyers, but they are still destroyers. But then in the middle of World War II, the US Navy reclassifies them as light cruisers, albeit very light cruisers. And then you have the Capitani Romanis, which are just a fraction above. And, most people will say the Mogadors are really big destroyers and the Capitani Romanis are really small cruisers. But obviously, as we just mentioned, the US Navy at the time thought a little bit differently. So, personally, I would probably come down on the side of saying that during the Second World War, start to finish, if you're above 3,000 tons, you're a cruiser. If you're below 3,000 tons standard, you're a destroyer. But you can dance very, very close to that line. Then, when you get into the cruiser category, I would say, I think you could probably get up to about 12 to 13,000 tons and still be plausibly called a light cruiser. I think if you're going above, at least, definitely if you're going above 13,000 tons pre-war with a 6-inch armed ship, you've gone a little bit too far as far as a light cruiser is concerned. You can go higher with a heavy cruiser, but I think a light cruiser, at least a well-designed light cruiser, probably should cap out around there. With a heavy cruiser, again, at the start of the war, 13 to 14,000 tons, maybe 15 if you're really pushing it, but I'd say probably more around 14,000 is what you need for a good heavy cruiser, an 8-inch cruiser. Again, if you're going above that, you're going a little bit above and beyond. You're just being inefficient. Now, the weird thing is there is a bit of a gap, because if you have a 15, 16, 17,000 ton ship, that's not big enough, in my opinion, to count as a small capital ship, but it is big enough to go, look, you're just being stupid. You've been hilariously inefficient or impractical in designing your cruisers. Once you edge past about 20,000 tons, then I think you start classifying as a small capital ship. Of course, by the end of the war, you have really big stuff in the works, like the Minotaurs, which don't get built, the Worcesters, which just about do, and the Des Moines, of course, which all push the displacement of what is classified as a cruiser up considerably. And then you get into the whole argument of what the heck the Alaskas are. And then, of course, once you, at least pre-war, 20,000 tons and upwards is a battleship or capital ship of some description. By the end of the war, I would say your treaty era capital ship at full displacement, so around 35,000 tons, is probably your entry level now for true capital ships by the end of the war. And you will notice big gulfs in those size classifications once you get past the cruiser-destroyer line. But that's simply because, similar to what I said about cruisers, below a certain size or certain displacement for the next ship type up, but above that size on the next class down, you're just in a realm where you're a bit too big and a bit too expensive to really be a practical and efficient version of the smaller class, but you're too small and too weak to be a practical and efficient version of the bigger class. Lord Druken asks, it seems that during World War II, the battleships of European navies tended to stick to the 15-inch gun as their primary armament, in contrast to the use of 16-inch guns in the American and Japanese navies, the 18-inch guns of the Yamatos being a notable exception. Was there a particular strategic or manufacturing reason why the European navies stuck with a 15-inch? There's a few reasons, but two of the larger ones are simply that if you are trying to stick to the treaty requirements for displacement, or at least you're trying to pretend that you're sticking to the treaty requirements for displacement, a 15-inch gun, its associated turret, and protection against said gun is realistically about as large as you can go and retain decent speed and decent range without making some kind of dramatic compromise. The Royal Navy, of course, considers 15-inch guns for the King George V. They end up dropping to 14-inch, in part because they want to put the saved weight into protection. The French get decent protection, decent firepower, and decent speed by use of their artificial circulation boilers, and the Germans and the Italians end up just cheating. So, there is that. I think if you're going to do a well-balanced treaty battleship that covers all aspects of speed, protection, and firepower relatively well, without perhaps being particularly excessive in any of them, the 15-inch gun is probably about as large as you're going to go. And yes, before anyone points out the South Dakotas exist, yes, the South Dakotas are a significant feat of engineering, showing you can get a 16-inch ship with decent protection and speed into a 35,000-ton wrapper. However, the South Dakotas do make some fairly significant compromises in other areas, like size, in terms of being quite short, dumpy little things, and a few other areas as well. Hence why I said well balanced. Now, there is one other rather big elephant in the room, which is that because of the lack of warship development, essentially, and the associated technologies during the interwar period as regards capital ships, people haven't really moved on to building and testing newer and bigger guns. So the development of a modern gun to arm your battleships with essentially means you have to use a similar caliber to what you were using before, or you have to invest a considerable amount in your gun making foundries to upgrade the gun pits and all of this to make a substantially larger weapon. So the Germans obviously had Bayern and Baden and Saxon and Württemberg, for that matter, under construction. They used 15-inch guns, admittedly slightly shorter 15-inch guns than were finally used on the Bismarcks, but they were also considering 16.5-inch guns for things like the L-20E Alphas. And it just so happens that, the 16.5-45 gun, lengthwise, it's very close to the 38cm SKC-34, which would arm the Bismarcks. So you just have to play around a little bit with existing gun pits. You don't have to do anything larger. Whereas if they tried to do a 16-inch gun, you would have needed to build bigger gun pits if you're doing a long barrel version, which what the Germans were looking at as an alternative. And similarly, you had the Caracciolo, you had 15-inch guns being built by the Italians towards the end of the First World War. Now, granted, that was a relatively short 15-inch gun, so there would have been some work that was needed for the Littorio class's 50 caliber weapons, but it's still a 15-inch, so shell manufacturing techniques don't have to upgrade themselves that much, and overall size of things like lathes, barrel boring machines, presses for the individual hoops, etc. None of that really has to be changed that much to make just a longer 15-inch gun in the way that, doing a 16 or 18-inch would have. The British, of course, have the Lions. They're planning them with 16-inch. They are going to have to build new 16-inch guns, but they did have the 16-inch guns built for the Nelson, so they have a little bit of an institutional leg up at that point there. Reva's Rambling Recess asks, remembering the flag rooms aboard HMS Victory got me thinking just how much spare cloth was actually aboard a ship of her size while at sea. In the tradition of repairing as they went, for signals and the like, did it come in different colours, or did they have the dyes if they needed to make a repair, or was there something entirely different going on? Just how much spare sailcloth did they have in general, and where would they store it? Well, spare sails would be stored aboard ship, entire whole spare sails. I mean, here's one. This is a spare sail from the Vasa, one of several that were recovered, and they were generally stored deep in the hold, so you know where the rope storage is. That kind of level below the waterline would also be generally where you would store big spare sails, and they would be whole sails, quite literally whole sail. Obviously folded up nice and neatly, but you'd have to bring it up through the hatchways because, you ain't man packing a full sail's worth of canvas up the ladders or stairs, depending on the ship in question. You might even store it a little bit deeper in the hold, depends on your exact ship and a few other factors as well. On top of various spare sails, you wouldn't carry a full outfit of spare sails, but you carry some spare sails. You would also obviously carry spare sail cloth in bolts or rolls, which you could use for patching some of the bigger sails and making general field repairs. But as far as signal flags and the like went, generally the best approach was to have several copies of the same flag, because apart from anything, at least if you're talking about the 19th century onwards, when you have a whole load of different signal flags, you might need to repeat a certain signal flag at a given point anyway, like the letter E, for example, very common in the English language. If you're having to phonetically spell stuff out, you might end up needing several E flags, and so you would have several sets of the more common signal flags, and usually at least one backup of all the others. So if you did lose one, got scullered, shot through, worn away, you could just replace it. You wouldn't tend to carry multiple bolts of lots of different colours of cloth for making up your own signal flags as you went, but you would also have, for ruse de guerre and things like that, various foreign flags aboard, as well as potentially even multiple different types of squadron flag. So for a Royal Navy ship, for example, in the classic Age of Sail, you might carry a white ensign, a red ensign, and a blue ensign, and multiple copies of those ensigns in different sizes, just in case you were assigned to different squadrons. Now, normally that wasn't the case, and you have things like the Battle of the Nile, where recent reinforcements that were flying under a different coloured Royal Navy ensign are still flying that different coloured ensign at the Battle of the Nile, even though technically speaking they should be flying at Nelson's ensign. But it's not considered a massive deal. Same thing at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. And I suppose if needed, you could cannibalize one of the foreign ensigns you might be carrying if you absolutely needed urgent replacement of a specific signal flag. But ultimately, this is a warship, not a haberdashery, so there is a limit to the many types of spares you might carry. Although some of the more inventive officers might have small collections of dye aboard, which obviously take up a lot less space, and you could use to potentially dye cloth if you, again, needed to urgently make up a signal flag. Stefan Pirot asks, how did newly assigned captains prepare themselves for their new command? For instance, how was the German Kapitän zur See Fritz Hinze expected to know the Scharnhorst inside and out in such limited time? As far as I know, neither he nor Erich Bay had much or any experience with commanding a battleship, yet they were ordered out to sea less than 2 months after they were assigned. How did they know the ship's capabilities, flaws, and operational procedures? Especially in a navy like the Kriegsmarine, it seems to have been a very steep learning curve in capital ship command, whereas in other navies like the Royal or American, most captains seem to flow more gradually and smoothly into their commands. Well, up-and-coming naval officers in all navies would be expected to study, at least to a certain degree, the capabilities of various ships, and they'd have some operational details as well, because they either operate alongside them or perhaps serve on some larger ships in earlier stages of their careers. So they'd have some idea what they were capable of, perhaps from some practical experience, although not necessarily in command, and from operating, as said, alongside them in day-to-day practice. Then, of course, once you are in command, you should have a reliable staff supporting you. And they should then be, obviously they understand the ship should be able to carry out your orders and be able to tell you what you can and can't do if you're being a little bit unrealistic. And I think in some ways it reflects different priorities within different navies, because in some navies, it seems to me at least, the captain is expected to understand exactly how every part of his ship runs. Almost kind of like if the chief gunner is knocked out, the captain should know enough about gunnery to be able to almost take over, and the same with engineering and so forth. Obviously, that's not going to work in practice, but the principle seems to be enshrined in certain navies, whereas in other navies, while a captain might have picked up an expertise in engineering or gunnery or navigation or something like that on their way up the command ladder, they're expected to be a tactical and strategic decision maker and a leader. The practicalities of turning those intentions into operational reality is held to be more the job of the specialists of the various departments. Now, of course, you do have to know something about the capabilities of your ships. How fast are they? Roughly what firepower and armor have you got, etc. But under that school of naval thought, you only need a limited idea of all of this before you turn around and should be able to give general orders to effect some change on the enemy, ideally, obviously, some kind of violent change. Now, granted, some navies, you do get a much more gentle introduction. So, for example, at least in peacetime, in the US Navy, if you wanted to command a battleship, you had to spend at least one tour of duty as the XO of a battleship, which that rather obviously gives you both command and operational experience aboard a battleship, so you can slot into the captain's role a lot easier. Although, compared to, as you said, with Bay, the biggest thing he'd commanded up until that point was a destroyer. And then suddenly he's like, you are now an admiral. Congratulations. Here's the Scharnhorst. Have fun. But I have a feeling that's as much a reflection of wartime constraints as it is anything else, because you certainly wouldn't be thrown in at the deep end quite like that in most of the peacetime German Navy. Although, to be fair, for most of the peacetime German Navy, there weren't any capital ships for them to man in the first place, apart from a couple of old pre-dreadnoughts, but there you go. HMAS Albatross asks, I think it's fair to say that US Navy treaty-era battleship classes had compromises in their designs in order to comply with the treaties, the North Carolinas notably not being armoured against their own guns due to the late change to 16-inch caliber, and the South Dakotas having another set of compromises to squeeze in a balance of speed, protection and firepower that the US Navy wanted on 35,000 tons. It seems to me that the Royal Navy's design process leading up to and into World War II was very reluctant to go ahead with designs that were perceived to have too many compromises, or a major flaw in one aspect of a design. If both of these designs had been drafted for the Royal Navy before the treaty era collapsed, do you think the Royal Navy would have found either or both designs acceptable to build, and which one do you think they would favour? Now, practically, there are quite a few red flags for the Royal Navy in terms of both the North Carolina and South Dakota designs, but those are more general to the Royal Navy and how it designed ships, period, at the time, as opposed to the design specifically. For example, the US use of high-pressure boilers. The Royal Navy would turn around and say, we don't like the manpower requirements, we don't like the maintenance requirements, we prefer lower-pressure boilers. But if we ignore those larger-scale issues, which, as I say, they're more about the Navy rather than the ship designs themselves, and look at the specific strengths and weaknesses inherent to those two, the 35,000-ton American capital ships, I think the Royal Navy definitely would have rejected the North Carolina designs. They thought the North Carolinas were reasonably impressive overall on paper, but you've got to remember, Royal Navy battle doctrine at the time thought that a decisive engagement range was going to be in the low tens of thousands of yards, maybe the mid tens of thousands if you were lucky. And the Royal Navy was very conscious of the fact that you had ships like the Nagato and the Colorado around, and potentially whatever the Yamato was going to become. Bear in mind, at that point they were thinking maybe it was going to be a 16-inch ship. So between that and 15-inch ships under construction in Europe, they are going to want a ship that it can withstand that kind of firepower. So they've got to withstand 15 and 16-inch shells, and ideally it's got to withstand those shells at least at relatively close ranges, medium battle range, you'd say. And unfortunately, the North Carolinas just aren't capable of doing that. They're designed to fight a long-range gunfight with 14-inch guns, and armoured against 14-inch shells. That's perfectly fine for US Navy doctrine, bearing in mind that outside of Nagato and Mutsu, a long-range gunfight with 14-inch guns is exactly what they're expecting to face against Fusos, Isseis, Congos, etc., etc. But for the British practice, North Carolina's armour scheme just isn't going to stand up to the kind of firepower they're expecting to potentially face at 14,000 yards. So they would consider it overgunned and under-armoured and reject it on that basis. The South Dakota is a bit more of an interesting one because, of course, the South Dakota is designed to withstand 16-inch gunfire, albeit at longer ranges, and it has 16-inch guns, and it has decent speed, and a good anti-aircraft battery, etc., etc. I think the general principle of the South Dakota class probably would meet with a reasonable amount of favour within the Royal Navy. They might still be a little bit leery of the armour scheme because, of course, again, it's designed around a longer range engagement profile. The sloped armour loses a significant amount of the sloped part's protectiveness as you get closer and closer, but it's still better than nothing. Royal Navy aircraft handling procedures call for a midships handling, not tail handling or fantail handling. And, of course, they're fairly compact designs. So I think the Royal Navy would have some issues with the South Dakotas, particularly around the fact that their armour scheme probably still isn't going to stand up brilliantly at 14,000 yards against 16-inch gunfire. But as a general overview, I think you could probably persuade the Royal Navy to accept the South Dakotas with a few tweaks, again, ignoring things like high-pressure machinery fits and so forth, much more readily than you'd get them to accept the North Carolinas. They wouldn't be particularly happy about it because, of course, the Lion type is what they wanted, but they could make it work. Salami Sales Express asks, "Hi Drac, history is full of examples where a new technology is resisted by leadership, and instead of implementing it wholesale, some half measure is compromised upon. Typically, it's found the half measure is worse than the new or the old technology by themselves, but are there any examples of these half-baked measures actually ending up superior?" I mean, in some ways it depends on what you want to define as a half-baked measure or a half measure. You could, by some definitions, for example, categorize the US 5-inch 38 as a half measure, because as I detailed in the video that I did about the origins of the 5-inch 38, the US was going, "Oh, well, we really like anti-surface guns, but we also need anti-aircraft guns. We've got the 5-inch 35, that's a pretty decent anti-aircraft gun, but we kind of want a dual-purpose gun as well, but we think it should be heavier. But then if we make it heavier, it's going to compromise our anti-aircraft capabilities." And essentially, they're having the same internal argument that the Royal Navy is having around about the same time. And then in an almost Solomonic level of brilliance, someone just goes and grabs a submarine deck gun and goes with a hacksaw, "Shunk, I have made a 5-inch 38 caliber gun. It shall do for both. Please shut up and start manufacturing it." I mean, it's a bit more complicated, hence why I did a whole video on it. But the general gist of it is that the 5-inch 38 was not actually what they were looking for at the beginning. They were looking for something that was going to supersede the 5-inch 25, but also somehow have the firepower of a 6-inch anti-surface gun. But then they ended up with, pretty much the best heavy anti-aircraft gun of World War II by, as I say, chopping up an old submarine deck gun and making a few modifications. Or to go back in history a bit further, you could look at the Razes. Yeah, people did build some heavy frigates in the aftermath of the War of 1812, 24-pounder or even 32-pounder frigates. But at the time, if you compare and contrast the various capabilities of various purpose-built heavy frigates, not just US ones, but some of the ones that the British and the French threw together or had thrown together in the past, and then you look at the capabilities of the stuff that they would introduce 5-10 years down the line, you can see what they were trying to aim for, but then you have someone rock up and just go, "Okay, we're going to take a couple of old ships of the line. We're just going to take off that upper gun deck. We're going to keep that lower gun deck," especially the 1810s era Razes, where they're keeping the 32-pounder lower gun deck. And suddenly you have a heavy frigate with the whole strength of a ship of the line, the full whole strength of the ship of the line, the sail and rigging plan of a ship of the line, but nowhere near the weight of the ship of the line, but you've got that nasty 32-pounder broadside. And suddenly everyone's going, that's actually really, really good. and then they spend the next 10, 20 years trying to better them. Or you could even look at the German Electra boats, the Type 21 and the Type 23, because ultimately the Germans were trying to wholesale replace diesel-electric propulsion with the Walther hydrogen peroxide system. They developed the Type 18 hull, and then they hit some roadblocks with the technology, and then someone just goes, well, diesel-electric but more battery in Type 18 hull equals Type 21. And yes, of course, they have all the production issues trying to do all the modular construction and everything, but a working Type 21 is a really darn good submarine for World War II. And it's a half-baked measure. It's a Walter submarine with some old-school diesel-electric propulsion crammed in and a bunch of extra batteries for good measure, in very crude terms. So yeah, there's a few different examples I guess you could point to over time. And finally, for this week, Peter Guy asks, can you briefly describe the tactics in the Age of Sail regarding firing broadside volleys in combat? When ships of the line met in a line of battle, how long did they maintain simultaneous volleys of all guns before closing and engaging in boarding actions? At some point, did it devolve into a fire-at-will scenario instead of simultaneous volleys? And how did they coordinate raking fire when the attacking ship was passing astern of the enemy vessel, and thus not all guns could fire simultaneously, but had to wait to pass in sequence? A lot of this will depend on the tactics being used in a specific battle, because if you have overwhelming firepower, you're obviously going to give fewer volleys to your opponent, full broadsides before you close in and board. If you're equal or potentially even theoretically outgunned, there's probably going to be a longer gunnery duel going on, and obviously multiply up for, not just a 1v1, but you might be a 2v1 action or whatever. And other factors, like the relative size of the ships, capabilities, wind direction, and speed, and so on and so forth. Plus, are you fighting a 1v1 or a small squadron action or a fleet action? Because even if you're fighting a fleet action, you might theoretically have your opponent down and on the ropes, but even if they've surrendered or coming close to surrender, you might not be able to break out of the line to board them because you need to keep your place in the line of battle. So you might just have to keep hitting them and hitting them and hitting them until they give up, and then you send a boat over to accept the surrender rather than go in for a close range action. Whereas if it's a 1v1, you obviously have a lot more freedom to decide if you want to do that. Now, there is a psychological shock value as well as a material damage value to firing a full broadside as opposed to scattered shots with individual guns. So as long as you're in formation and as long as it's not to any particular disadvantage, you will want to maintain the firing of broadsides, or at least largely speaking broadsides. And if you've got a decently trained crew, they should be capable of reloading their guns in, roughly speaking, the same amount of time. So you're not losing that much by, let's say you can reload your guns once every 90 seconds using an arbitrary figure. That would be really, really good for the early Age of Sail. Still pretty good even in the late Age of Sail, but okay, so let's say you can reload in 90 seconds. Ultimately, if you're fighting an enemy ship, being able to unleash a full broadside every 95 or 100 seconds is going to have a lot more material and psychological effect on your opponent than perhaps your guns firing 5 to 10 seconds faster, which ultimately is not a huge amount in the grand scheme of things, but firing individually basically as they load. But as time goes on, people get tired, casualties start to build up, and perhaps you're not in a straight-up side-by-side confrontation and opportunities are coming and going to fire pretty much on a second-by-second basis. That is when you will kind of devolve into a fire-at-will kind of scenario where everybody just loads and fires as fast as they possibly can. And this can be a whole load of different examples. So it could be a swirling firefight, and once a lot of smoke's got going, you're just getting glimpses of the enemy as you maneuver, at which point, anyone who's loaded, fire at the enemy when you see them. Conversely, you could get something like Victory and Redoutable. You're locked alongside each other, at which point you can't miss, and at least in theory, the winner is going to be the one who pumps the most shots into your opponent. Therefore, everyone just fire as fast as you possibly can. Don't wait for anybody else. So essentially, once time becomes of the essence, that's when you go from broadside firing to fire at will. But it is something that each gun captain or the ship's captain is going to have to make a decision on, given the specific circumstances of the battle they're fighting. And in terms of coordinating raking fire, if you're passing astern or across the bow of an enemy ship and you can't bring everything to bear at once, well, this is where, again, the training of your gun crews pays off, because you'd give an order that might be similar to something like fire as you bear. And essentially what you're telling the gun crews then is, as your gun comes to bear on the target, that is when you will fire. And of course you've got the gun port, and the gunner can look along the length of the gun and out the gun port and go, okay, we're coming up in line with the enemy, and they're, to do the maximum damage, I've decided that we're going to fire now. And that, obviously, the exact choice of when to fire is going to be up to each gun captain as you pass by. But if your gun crews are well trained, they know, roughly how long it is between them initiating the firing and the gun actually firing. If you're using slow match and fuse, or if you're using flintlock, obviously that's going to all be very different amounts of time. And of course, you're vaguely aiming still. So, firing on the up roll or the down roll or whatever. And then, again, with appropriately trained gun crews, you will hopefully get a nice sequential rolling fire as you pass by, with every round doing damage. And that's why there's both a surprising amount of trust going on with Age of Sail crews and gun crews and their captains, both gun captains and captains of the ship, but also why training could make all the difference. Because, ultimately, when you look at various ships, you can go, yeah, on paper, this ship has a bigger broadside weight, or this ship has an extra deck of guns, or all sorts of theoretical on-paper advantages. But in the Age of Sail, when a huge amount of how a battle is decided by the men, as much or more than the technology, if one ship, might have a 15% smaller broadside, but can fire 2 or 3 times faster because the gun crews are well trained, that ship is going to be the one that wins. The bigger ship that can maybe get off one inaccurate broadside every 5 minutes, unless it's lucky enough to somehow maneuver itself into a position where that one big broadside can really be made to count, is probably on a hiding to nothing. And, given that you're stuck with a crew that can only fire one broadside every 5 minutes, I wouldn't put much money on the rest of your crew being able to maneuver the ship that well either. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this month. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning into this one. Even though, as I say, we are very, very early for a Patreon Drydock. But hope you've enjoyed it, and hope to see you again in another video at some point fairly soon. Thanks very much. Bye for now.